Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Trumos, Chapter 2, Halacha 3 in the Art Scroll on 24b1, and today we're getting into other rules on which produce should be given preference when you're going to be separating Truma. And the Mishnah starts off, and it says that someone who separates different types of olives is going to separate oil olives as truma on behalf of picking olives, but he may not separate pickling olives as truma on behalf of oil olives. Now, oil olives are going to be rich in oil, and the Rambam is going to explain that these oil olives, they're used to make oil, and you're going to press them. And the pickling olives are olives that when you press them, they have very little oil, and therefore they're not intended for pressing. They're only intended to pick it and to put it in some vinegar and to pickle it. And several commentators are going to be asking that olives that are designated for oil but not yet pressed are considered to be unprocessed and therefore unfit to be designated as truma. So how is it that this Mishnah is saying that they can be separated as truma? And the commentators are going to come and explain this and say that these particular oil olives don't need further processing because they're intended for eating, and therefore they can be designated as truma. Now, they're also going to be saying that the unprocessed produce is unfit to also have as truma separated on its behalf, and this prohibition is stated only with regard to olives intended for the oil, not olives that are intended for other uses like pickling. Now, we're used to really being around pickling olives, but there is a difference. I live in Israel, and you do see olive trees that are used for olive oil, and those olives, they ooze oil out of them, versus like other ones where it doesn't really ooze oil. The Mishnah continues and says, similarly, someone who separates uncooked wine as truma on behalf of cooked wine, but may not separate cooked wine as truma on behalf of uncooked wine. In both cases, you have a superior product that's chosen as truma, and it's being chosen over the longer-lasting one. In other words, the pickled olives are going to be longer lasting, and oil olives are going to taste better, but pickling olives are going to last longer. Uncooked wine is going to taste better, but cooked wine is going to keep longer. So again, we have a Doraita verse saying that the truma is supposed to be separated from the superior produce. So the question is, okay, well, which is really going to be superior? If something is going to last longer, is that going to be a category for superior, or is it going to be the one that tastes better and is more delightful? So the idea is that somebody's going to separate truma from the tastier, superior product in accordance with the requirement to separate somebody's choicest product as truma. And the Mishnah is ruling that this requires somebody to choose quality over durability. The Gemara is going to get more into this, but in the last Mishnah, it was talking about how somebody cannot separate truma from one species on behalf of another, and the Mishnah is going to add to this rule for determining whether two types of produce are going to be separate species. And the Mishnah says that this is a general rule. Any plant that is kalayim with its fellow is of a different species, and therefore one may not separate truma from this one on behalf of that one, not even from the superior one on behalf of the inferior one. Now, kalayim, you can check that out in the first few halachot in our kalayim videos, and the first Mishnahs over there give lists of, it's called pairs, the pairs of plants that are not kalayim with one another. In other words, they're like the same species, even though they're going to look a little bit different. And that's how the Gemara refers to those Mishnahs over there in kalayim. It refers to them as pairs. And so the kalayim is basically going to be where you have a prohibited planting of a mixture of different species, and they can't be within a certain area from one another. This is in Vayikra 19:19. And a subspecies is going to be deemed to be the same species. So there's no kalayim issue over that. And so an example like that would be barley and oats. Barley and oats are going to be deemed to be like subspecies of one another. and but wheat and barley are going to be two different kinds of grains with two different kinds of species that you can't plant close to. You have to have setbacks and you have to have separations. And again, let me reread this Mishnah. So it says that this is a general rule: any plant that is kalayim with its fellow is of a different species, therefore may not separate truma from this one on behalf of the other, and not even from the superior one for the inferior one. Now, what would be a case of a superior one and inferior one? Wheat is generally regarded as superior over barley. So they're also, by the way, in this list of pairs and kalayim, going to be listed as separate sets of pairs, which means that they're kalayim with one another, and they are very different. And so, even though you had some wheat, could you separate on behalf of barley or barley on behalf of wheat? No. Why? You might say, oh, but the wheat is superior and I have barley and I'm improving this. The Goan's going to get something better. But the problem is with this, what this Mishnah is trying to teach, is they're different species. It has to be the same species. So the Mishnah now is going to talk about a law of someone who does transgress by separating inferior produce on behalf of superior produce. Now, the question is that, well, what happens if I'm making these violations? It's serious because maybe I still have tevel. In other words, maybe it's not going to count as a separation, and so I didn't actually rectify this pile. I have to go ahead and do it again. So the Mishnah says that if someone separated truma from inferior produce on behalf of superior produce, his truma is truma. And we need to know this because it gets hold of truma sanctity. And the tevel produce from which it's taken now becomes permitted for use. And by the way, the Gemara is going to get into the verses how this all gets derived. And one of the key points about this is, let's say you have fresh figs and you have dried figs, and one is considered superior in quality. We need to know this because the Torah tells you to separate from the superior produce. Now, what happens if they went ahead and they separated it? It's the same species. It's like for like. One is a fresh fig, one is a dried fig. Does this hold? Does this become truma? Yes, it does. But you say, but wait a second. But the verse says superior, and you're giving something else to the cone. But you could always say with this that I am giving something superior. I'm giving something that's longer lasting. I'm giving something that's preserved. And so while this one might taste better right now, it might only last for a day or two, and this one will last for years. And so did you really cheat the cone? No, it's a matter of how you're looking at it. The Gemara is looking at superior produce and saying, okay, we're judging it based on taste and freshness, right? But you could also look at it in terms of longer lasting being the more quality version. So it's subjective. But what's out of this in this Mishnah is saying, oh, well, I'm going to separate, this inferior barley for this superior wheat. Even though the wheat is superior, that's going to be invalid because it's a different species. And then it's going to say that what this Mishnah says, if one separated truma from inferior produce on behalf of superior produce, his truma is truma, except in the case of darnel, separated his truma on behalf of wheat, which is not considered truma since darnel is not a food. Now, darnel comes up as the first thing that's mentioned in the first halacha, in the first Mishnah of Masechet Kalayim, in the first chapter, and you could check our video over there for that, but it's very interesting. This is a degraded form of wheat. It's used in Arabia to feed pigeons, says the Gemara, and this is a curse. This is a curse when the people were sitting there before the flood, sinning and things like that. Hashem transformed the wheat into this inferior darnel as a curse, as a blemish, as a blight, and it's also being stated that you can have it where your wheat field will turn into darnel and it'll turn into something cursed. So if you have this darnel, of course you can't separate it for truma on behalf of wheat. First of all, the darnel is not considered food, even though it's not going to be kalayim with wheat. But second of all, this is sort of like, divine punishment. Like, you ended up getting this darnel. And by the way, you could see photos of this in the internet of what darnel looks like. They grow it on a couple of islands around in, I believe in Ireland. They still grow it. and they're growing it for like bird food or something. But anyway, the point is that people can't eat it, and in general, the general Gemara and general idea about it from Kalayim is that this is a blemished thing that will, you're doing all sorts of sins, and Hashem transforms your wheat field into darnel. Now, you got a curse from Hashem, so how could it be that you could go tithe something that you got a curse for, something that's really rotten produce, something that's inferior? And you say, but it's not Kalayim, and it's not. But this is inferior produce, and the wheat is superior produce. So the note by the Rosh Hashanah about this is that they look, the darnel will look like wheat, but it can't serve as truma for wheat. And the correct word over here is zunin, which is a corrupted form of wheat that's going to grow in a wheat field, but unfit for human consumption, says the Rosh Hashanah. And the name of the word refers to zona, which means to go astray. And it's going to be talking about these mutations that occur in the plant, and these are curses that come. So, while it's similar, wheat is eaten by a person, and, the wheat is superior, darnel is a cursed thing. And you got this curse because of your sins. You can't go turn this into a truma tithe for fixing, a pile of darnel, turning it into weed or something like that. The Mishnah talks about the status of different types of melon, and it says that a chait melon and the musk melon are considered one species with regard to truma, and the chait melon is going to be a bland variety of melon. You find it here in the shuk in Israel. It's not exactly a zucchini. It's not exactly a cucumber. It's just a long, light green, sort of like zucchini that grows here, but it's not a zucchini, and it's very, very bland. And it looks a little bit different than a zucchini, so it's really not a zucchini. But I think that's what they're talking about. And it says that there's a dissenting view, and Rabbi Yehuda says that they're two different species. And this also, by the way, comes up in Kalayim, and Rabbi Yehuda over there in Kalayim in 1-2 also disputes that. Anyway, let's get into the Gemara. Rabbi Yochanan is going to identify the author of this Mishnah, and he says that the Mishnah is in accordance with the view of Rabbi Yehuda. He's saying in the previous Mishnah that one must always separate truma from superior produce, even when there's no cone around, and, by the way, when the produce might spoil. And this is the reason that the Mishnah is giving preference to oil olives over pickling olives, and uncooked wine over cooked wine. But according to the Tanna Kama of the last Mishnah, one separates truma from superior produce only if there's a cone there. And if there's no cone there, one separates from that which is going to be able to be kept. In other words, the Tanna Kama is saying that if there's nobody there, the superior produce is the longer lasting one. That's going to be considered the most choice one. And it's not going to be ostensibly the one that is there for taste right this second that might spoil, especially if there's no cone there. So Rabbi Yochanan's view might be learned from this Malokit from Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, and it says that there was another Mishnah that is going to be in chapter 11 in Trumos in Halacha 1 that states that, says this Gemara, says Rabbi Yehuda permits cooking wine of Truma because cooking wine improves it. And Rabbi Yochanan said regarding that Mishnah that the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda has been confused with the Tanna Kama. And in fact, Rabbi Yehuda, who prohibits cooking wine as Truma, and the Tanna Kama who permits it, otherwise Rabbi Yehuda's statement that cooking wine improves a wine would contradict his ruling in this Mishnah, which assumes that cooked wine is inferior to cooked wine. So, from Rabbi Yochanan's solution to the apparent contradiction between the Mishnahs, we see that, in his opinion, the teaching of our Mishnah follows the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, the Gemara is going to cite a dissenting view regarding the contradiction between the two Mishnahs, and Rabbi Lazar said that the position of Rabbi Yehuda has not been confused with that of the Tanna Kama, and indeed, Rabbi Yehuda, who permits cooking wine of Truma, because cooking improves the wine, And as for the apparent contradiction between the Mishnah and this Mishnah, it's not a difficulty. The Gemara says that there in chapter 11, the Mishnah is dealing with a Kohen who cooks his truma wine to preserve it. And that is what Rabbi Yehuda means when he states that cooking improves the wine. But here, we're dealing with the Yisrael owner who wants to designate cooked wine as truma on behalf of the uncooked wine. And so the uncooked wine is inferior to the uncooked wine, and that is going to be forbidden. Wine is superior to cooked wine. And it's for this reason that Rabbi Yehuda rules in our Mishnah that in separating truma, one must choose the uncooked wine over the cooked wine. Now, as for Rabbi Yehuda's statement in the Mishnah below that cooking wine improves it, that's going to be in chapter 11, the case there is going to be dealing with a Kohen for whom preserving the wine is more important than the taste. And although objectively speaking, the wine is not improved through cooking, Rabbi Yehuda describes the Kohen's preference as an improvement, and that's how he's going to permit it. And the Tanna Kama is going to rule that despite the Kohen's wishes, cooking is forbidden because it reduces the wine. In other words, there's a loss to it. And so the obligation has to be fulfilled objectively with superior produce. And the idea is that the uncooked wine is going to be unquestionably superior produce. The problem that the Tanna Kama have is not that one is going to be superior, one's going to not be superior. The problem that they have over there with chapter 11 is going to be that you wasted some. You evaporated a lot of it away, and you took something that had Kedusha and you reduced it, you destroyed it. And that's going to be their problem. Now, having looked at Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar's dispute regarding whether Rabbi Yehuda permits the cooking of truma wine, the Gemara discusses a related dispute between them regarding the opposing view of that Mishnah in chapter 11, which states that cooking wine reduces it. So that's one of the deeper ideas with Rabbi Yehuda's point versus the Tanna Kama. What's going to happen with the reduction of wine? It's basically like destruction. In other words, if you're cooking it, a lot of it evaporates, some of it evaporates, and you took something that has Kedusha and you turned it into nothing. Now, there's going to be a maloket between Rabbi Yochanan's reading and Rabbi Lazar's reading, whether Rabbi Yehuda is going to permit the cooking of truma wine. And the Gemara says that Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yochanan disagree as to the meaning of the statement. And one says that cooking is prohibited because it reduces the numbers of those who will drink the wine. In other words, that the taste will get to be bad. In other words, the flavor of cooked wine is more intense, and some people don't like that flavor and intense. And the idea is if you're going to look at it like that, then by changing the flavor of the wine, the taste of the wine, that you turned it into an inferior state. Now, the other one is going to say that cooking it is prohibited because it reduces the wine's measure. In other words, some of the wine evaporated, and that is going to be a destruction of truma, and that's going to be what is forbidden. Now, the Gemara says at first, we did not know which of these two, in other words, Rabbi Elazar or Rabbi Yochanan, said the first explanation, says Gemara, and which said the other explanation. However, from that which Rabbi Yochanan said, that the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda has been confused with that of the Tanna Kama, and from that which Rabbi Elazar responded, that the position of Rabbi Yehuda has not been confused with that of the Tanna Kama. Rather, the Mishnah over there in chapter 11 in Trumos is going to be dealing with Kohanim, while the Mishnah here is going to be dealing with an owner who's a Yisrael, and the Gemara says we established that it was Rabbi Yochanan, not Rabbi Elazar, who said, because cooking reduces the numbers of those who will drink the wine. So the idea is that according to Rabbi Yochanan, who's comparing the two Mishnahs, the one over here in chapter 2, Halacha 3 that we're doing now, and the one over there in Trumos chapter 11, that Rabbi Yochanan's ruling, or Rabbi Yehuda's ruling, in the one in chapter 11 is going to be like his ruling in this Mishnah in chapter 2, and that both rulings are due to the damage that results when cooking wine. Now, Rabbi Yehuda's prohibition on a Kohen to cook the truma wine, and his prohibition on a Yisrael to separate cooked wine, his truma on behalf of uncooked wine, derives from a single source. And the Mara Fulda is going to be explaining that in the later Mishnah, the one in chapter 11, that the damage inherent in cooking wine is referred to as he reduces it. In other words, some of it evaporates away and you have a smaller measure. So if this is referring to the reduction of the wine's volume, it's not relevant to the Yisrael's prohibition to designate wine as truma, because the designation takes place after the wine has been cooked. So that too will result in no loss of volume for the Kohen. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, where he's saying he reduces it, it refers to a reduction of the number of people who will be able to drink the wine. Why? Because cooking the wine, while it might last longer, ends up being detrimental to the flavor. It damages the flavor, and so the damage by the cooking affects the wine's quality. And that is also going to be relevant to Rabbi Yuda's ruling. So according to Rabbi Lazar, where he's saying he reduces it, it's referring not to the reduction of the number of drinkers, but to a reduction of the volume. So you have a big question, right? The big question is, well, we have to give to the superior product, right? We have to take from the superior product, and they're saying that, look, if you've cooked it, on one hand, you've made it so it lasts longer. On the other hand, you reduced volume. And on the other hand, you've also reduced the number of people who might actually drink it because it doesn't taste as good. So which is going to be the superior quality that you want? You want something that lasts longer or something that doesn't quite taste as good as the fresh one? So the Gemara is going to cite a ruling regarding this dispute. Rabbi Yudah, the son of Rabbi Imi, says in the name of Rish Lakish that it is prohibited to cook truma wine because it reduces the numbers of those who will drink the wine. In other words, they're coming to make a ruling, and they're saying that, well, wait a second, maybe it's not from the evaporation. Maybe the problem is going to be because you made it taste not as good. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, cooking the wine is what results in a loss of the quality. And so in other words, you have a smaller volume. And this is very consistent with what we were dealing with these figs that shrank, right? In other words, the volume got smaller. And so the Brisa contradicts Rabbi Yochanan. It states that, or a Brisa contradicts Rabbi Yochanan. It states that one may separate truma even from cooked wine on behalf of uncooked wine, and that implies that one certainly may separate truma from uncooked wine on behalf of cooked wine. And the idea here is that this is talking about a case where Rabbi Yudah forbids designating cooked wine as truma on behalf of uncooked wine, but this Bryce is permitting it. So that clearly follows like Rabbi Yudah's disputants, who would be the Tanakama. So it seems that this Brisa follows the view of Rabbi Yudah's disputants, the Tanakama, but it's implying that cooked wine is inferior to uncooked. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yudah's disputants hold that cooked wine is superior. So doesn't that seem to contradict it? Now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, this later Mishnahs confused the views of Rabbi Yudah and Tanakama. So in fact, it's going to be Rabbi Yudah who prohibits the cooking of truma wine because it reduces the wine, and his disputants who permit the cooking because they're going to say it improves the wine. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's view is like this, that the statement that he reduces the wine refers to the number of drinkers, and that's going to be a reference to the flavor of the wine that gets reduced as it gets stronger by cooking it, more intense. And by the way, when you're doing fine French cooking and you want to make a sauce and you're going to put in wine and you're going to reduce it, the idea to reduce it to make a French sauce is that you're intensifying the flavor. So everybody knows about this. The wine flavor gets more intense. The French use it in their cooking for making sauces all the time. And this brisa that we have is saying that one is permitted to separate even cooked wine from uncooked. And that's implying that the cooked wine is inferior to uncooked. So that seems to contradict Rabbi Yochanan. But keep in mind, what's going to be regarded as superior? Well, you can come along, and that's been the theme of the last of chapter 2, halacha 3, which is to say that the cooked wine has greater quality because it lasts longer. Just like the dried figs last longer than the figs that might go bad after a day or two. Well, okay, fine. If you have a Kohen that's there right now who's going to sit and eat the figs right now, fine, right? But maybe there's no Kohanim there. Maybe you're in a city with no Kohanim. Maybe you're in a town with no Kohanim. Then what do? Well, giving him the product, says the Tanakama, that is going to be regarded as longer lasting is going to be deemed by the Tanakama as superior. Now, Rabbi Yehuda always was saying that you give them the best tasting regardless, and if it spoils, it spoils. But even if there's no cone there, but the Tanakama say no, there's wastage there, and what is going to be regarded as superior? The one that's longer lasting. So even though objectively this wine might not taste as good, it's going to be longer lasting, and so there's always a fear in both shasas of wine turning into vinegar. So the Gemara is going to be finishing up. We have a little bit to go, and the Gemara is going to resolve this difficulty. Rabbi Imi says that Rabbi Yochanan did not teach this brisa, and he did not consider it to be reliable. In other words, he didn't consider it to be of reliable provenance, and therefore there's no difficulty. So the Mara Fulda is going to be explaining that this Tosefta, it's going to be in 4.3 by the way, perhaps represents a revised version of a brisa, and that's going to be mended in accordance with Rabbi Yochanan's understanding. And accordingly, when the Gemara is stating that Rabbi Yochanan did not teach this brisa, it means that he did not teach it in the earlier form, and they revised it to understand, to reflect his understanding that the cooked wine is inferior to uncooked. Now, the Mishnah stated that if somebody transgresses and separates inferior produce on behalf of superior produce, his truma is valid. Now, we want to know, where is this going to say that in Scripture? Rabbi Bun Barkana says in the name of Rebbe that the verse states regarding the designation of Trumas Meiser. In other words, Numbers 18:32. By the way, this verse is talking about the Levim to separate Trumas Meiser. They take that, by the way, from the Meiser Rishon. And over there, it's being taught from an earlier verse in Numbers 18:29 that somebody has to separate from the choicest part of his Meiser as Trumas Meiser. Now, this clearly seems to be done as a hekesh to extend to all the other ties. In other words, it's using one of the 13 principles of understanding the logic of how the Torah resolves halacha, and one of these is going to be the binyanav. And so, in other words, what Rebbe is implying is that this is really a binyanav, that they're talking about this one case over here with Trumas Meiser, and they're not mentioning it with any of the other ties. And so because they're mentioning it over here, then you can extrapolate it out to be all the other ties. So it says that the verse states regarding the designation of Trumas Meiser, and says, and you shall bear no sin on this account when you separate the best of the Meiser Rishon as Truma. This implies, by the way, if somebody did not designate the best as Truma and designates inferior produce, then he does bear sin. And from that which bears a sin for separating inferior produce, you know that what he has done, he has done. In other words, his Truma designation is valid nonetheless. Otherwise, there would be no sin. So this Gemara is intended to demonstrate that although one is required to separate superior product as Truma, if you failed to do so and you took the second best product, you did not invalidate the Truma. Rather, the inferior product he separates is going to be valid ex post facto. Now, in this maloket that we've been dealing with, you have two cases, right? One is going to last longer, and one side says that this is deemed to be superior. The other side, Rabbi Yehuda, is saying that this one objectively tastes better. You should give the fresh one because objectively is better. So really, one will say that this one is inferior because of that reason. One will say that's inferior because of this reason. In other words, the ones who say that cooking it will make it better say that, well, if it spoils or it doesn't last very long and the Kohanim can't get the wine or they can't get the figs or the dried fruit, then that's really a loss to the Kohen. And so what's going to be deemed to be better? Okay, fine, maybe these dried fruits don't taste quite as good, or the wine that's cooked doesn't quite taste as good, but they'll say it's superior because it lasted longer. You could give it to the Kohen. There was no loss. And Rabbi Yehuda will say, yeah, but it doesn't taste as good. And so, it's up for the Kohanim to come and get it. And if it spoils, it spoils. But objectively, they'll say this is better. But the idea is that from this side, this is better and this is inferior. So because it's written like this, there's really, in the Torah, there's no problem. Both sides can, fit it where they say, like, oh, well, if you took from the second best, it's still valid. In other words, from either side, nobody's saying that this is an invalid separation. They're just saying that you shouldn't do this. So the Mishnah said, except in the case of darnel, and again, the Mishnah is ruling that truma separated from inferior produce on behalf of superior produce is valid, except for the case of darnel. That's going to be this corrupted form of wheat, and if that is separated on behalf of wheat, then there's a problem. Why? Because darnel is not food, or, by the way, in one place in the world, it can be considered animal food, and you're not supposed to separate animal food on behalf of human food. So there would be a problem with that as well. And it's also not going to be a valid truma, and the Gemara is going to explain. The Gemara says that this implies that something that is considered food, even though it's going to be a corrupted form, can be designated as truma on behalf of the uncorrupted form of the same food. Now, the two foods are not kalayim. We covered that in chapter 1, halacha 1 of Masechet Kalayim, and darnel is actually the first word in kalayim. So an example of this would be the designation of wine vinegar, and that's going to be a corrupt, but you could still use that. It comes from wine, and the question is, can you separate truma on behalf of wine for vinegar, or vice versa? Now, this is the next logical step, right? Most people don't have darnel. Actually, what the Gemara in Kalayim is saying is that how did you get darnel? You got it from your sins, right? Hashem turned something that was good into something that was bad, and that comes from one of the verses in the Tanakh. So the Mishnah follows the view, says this Gemara of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yosei, in the matter of wine vinegar and wine. And there's a brayso that taught that Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yossi, says in the name of his father that we may separate truma from wine on behalf of vinegar. Why? Because they're basically going to be deemed to be a single species. But wait a second, you say, but isn't this really just like the case of separating darnel for wheat? Because this is a corrupted form, right? Like, you don't really want vinegar per se when you can have the wine. So the Gemara continues, and it says, we may separate truma from wine on behalf of vinegar, but not from vinegar on behalf of wine, because vinegar is inferior to wine. And in other words, you must separate truma from the superior produce. And it says that if one transgressed and separated truma from vinegar on behalf of wine, in other words, the inferior on behalf of the superior, his truma is truma. But, Rebbe says, in other words, how did this come to be? Well, he's basically looking at the rest of the clause of the Mishnah. He's saying that, ex post facto, did you separate it? Yes. But Rebbe's going to come along and saying, no. Don't look at vinegar for wine like the rest of this, where you're talking about separating, dried figs on behalf of fresh figs, or fresh figs on behalf of dried figs. Don't look at it like that. Look at it in terms of darnel for wine, or for wheat. And Rebbe says that wine and vinegar are really considered two distinct species, and therefore one may not separate neither truma nor meiser for one on behalf of the other. In other words, Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, is considering wine and vinegar to be the same species, no different than dried figs and fresh figs. And it follows that Rebbe is basically saying that this is like the corrupted form and the uncorrupted form of food. And basically, Rebbe is going to be classifying wine and vinegar like two different species. In other words, it's going to be saying that you can't separate this for that. Now, it follows from this Mishnah, which implies that the corrupted form and uncorrupted form of food are not deemed to be separate species. That's the view of Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi. But the view of Rebbe, who's going to be classifying wine and vinegar as two different species, is really going to be looking at it by saying that in a way, the corrupted form, it's not deemed to be food. And because it's not deemed to be food, it's not valid. So question is, is vinegar deemed to be food? Well, vinegar is a seasoning. right? You don't drink vinegar. You don't eat vinegar. You don't consume vinegar. So you'd say, just like you don't consume darnel, you don't consume vinegar. Now you can sprinkle some vinegar on something, but sitting down to a cup of vinegar, nobody does that. So the Gemara is going to reject this assertion and demonstrate that our Mishnah can also be reconciled with Rebbe's view. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says that stands to reason that by biblical law, Rebbe would agree that wine and vinegar are classified as a single species, so that if truma were separated from one on behalf of the other, it would be valid. And so then what is Rebbe's reasoning for prohibiting the separation of truma from wine on behalf of vinegar? It's due to a rabbinic decree. And the rabbis fear that if you say this, that it's prohibited to separate truma from wine on behalf of vinegar, you might think also to say that's prohibited, that it's permitted to separate truma from vinegar on behalf of wine. In other words, to prevent this, the rabbis decreed that wine and vinegar are going to be regarded as two different species, and accordingly, neither may be separated as truma on behalf of the other. Now, Rebbe would agree that if one does separate truma from vinegar on behalf of wine, the truma is valid. But why? Because the two foods are really a single species. Now, this reading is basically going to be where, when you look at the Mishnah over in Kalayim chapter 1, Halacha 1, which is stating that wheat and darnel are not colliding with each other. Rebbe is stating that wine and vinegar, whose relationship parallels that of wheat and darnel, are really two species. And this is going to be out of a rabbinic concern that the Gemara is talking about. So by biblical law, Rebbe agrees that wine and vinegar are the same species. But it follows, says the Chazan Ish, that wheat and darnel are also one species, and therefore not collide with each other. So the idea ultimately is going to be that this rabbinic fence that Rebbe's talking about, while it seems that you have a deraita reason not to separate darnel for wheat, right? Because this is not food and this is food. That the rabbis are setting up a rabbinic fence that looks like this darnel for wheat issue on behalf of vinegar for wine. Now, deraita, it's going to be where it is going to be valid, but why is this in the Mishnah about the darnel? Because when you're looking at the reasoning, the underlying reasoning for why you don't separate vinegar for wine and this rabbinic fence, they're basically going to be pointing to the darnel for wheat, and they're basically going to be saying that this is not food, and you can't separate for something that's based on food. And just like with vinegar, that it's not food and you can't pour yourself a cup of vinegar and drink it, that you can't separate it on behalf of the wine. So the Mishnah stated that the chait melon, the musk melon, are considered one species with regard to truma. Rabbi Yehuda says they're two different species, and there's going to be a related dispute. The Gemara says the ruling of Rabbi Yehuda accords with the opinion stated elsewhere, and the ruling of the rabbis here accords with the opinion stated elsewhere. And we learned in a Mishnah there that the chait melon and the musk melon are not colliding with each other, and Rabbi Yehuda says they are colliding with each other. In other words, that dispute, like that of our Mishnah here, revolves around the question of whether these and these are going to be the same species. According to the Tanna Kama, they're one species, not colliding, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, they're two species. They are colliding. So this comes up also to explain the reasoning of the dispute in Kalayim. You can find it in the art scroll on page 2b. According to the sages, the chait melon seed sometimes can produce this watermelon, and watermelon can sometimes make this musk melon. And since a chait melon can yield a watermelon, and vice versa, it's deemed to be one species, and therefore not Kalayim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the musk melon is a hybrid. And because it's a hybrid, and it's going to be like a new species altogether. And the new species altogether, according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though it's a hybrid between two parent things, is unlike either parent. And so it's like a new species. But again, the question over here is, can you tie something from one species on behalf of another? No, that's why we care about Kalayim. So when we look at it, you might have people who don't learn so much coming along and saying, well, I have this barley, it's not so good, and I have this nicer wheat. I want to give something nice to the cone. So I'm going to separate some of this barley and but instead of taking out the barley, I'm gonna take it from the wheat, and I'm gonna fix, make sure that there's no tevel in the barley, and I'm going to give them a bigger portion of wheat. You say, wow, it's like you've combined the two piles, and basically you're taking out more of the finer product and giving it to the cone. Seems very nice. Seems like a nice thing to do, but in fact, you didn't fix the pile of barley at all. In other words, it's invalidated. Why? Because you can't tithe one species on behalf of the other, even if what you're giving him is a better, superior product. Because again, it's got to come from the same product, and that's really important because it's going to save us from a lot of mistakes and weird questions if you're going to allow somebody to separate this from that and they're different species. Have a great day. Save us from a lot of mistakes and weird questions if you're going to allow somebody to separate this from that and they're different species. Have a great day.